Welcome, everyone, to our third session on Candide with Dr. Alan Charles Kors. And he has some opening comments that he would like to make. And then I know there are many people still with questions to ask. So we'll start with your comments and then have time to discuss.
Let me just say a couple of things about the importance of this work, both in terms of the Enlightenment, in terms of the culture, and in terms of Voltaire. Um, this is someone who worked throughout the 1720s and 30s and 40s on simultaneously history, uh, issues of political and social reform, and also massive efforts to understand the world. Newtonian philosophy, what followed from Newton and Locke, our knowledge of the world, and very much the new theology, which caught Voltaire up in its appeal. And above all, this emerging, very optimistic sense that our senses, our reason, and our senses linked us to a world that the more we knew about it, the more we saw it could only be the creation of an infinitely good creator, a view reinforced in Leibnizian philosophy by reason itself. And Voltaire is very caught up in that. And then in his personal and in his civic life, he undergoes this series of just devastating experiences. The loss and humiliation of the loss of Madame du Châtelet, his being played by Frederick the Great in Prussia, is finding himself without a home and wandering, unable to stay anywhere. And he writes the poem on the Lisbon earthquake with all of his doubts. And then Rousseau's searing public letter to Voltaire on Providence, that he's written against God, that this is the best of all possible worlds, that he has taken away people's understanding and hope. And for the first time in his life, Voltaire struggles with an answer. The long writing of Candide, the shift in who's carrying his narrative in that book, uh, and it pours out of him at the end. He can't find philosophical answers that don't force him to deny the suffering of humanity, the unjustified suffering of humanity. And at the end, it's well said, all of these arguments, but we must cultivate our garden. And it frees him. As I said before, he's surprised by the ending of Candide. He's the most surprised by the ending of Candide. And the world is like this. He's reached that conclusion. The world is like this. There is inexplicable physical and moral evil in the world, even though everything is so designed and adapted and fine tuned in the world that things survive. And there is an intelligence that has designed it, but what has that got to do with human suffering? There's an astonishing statement when they meet the dervish. Um, and if you think of it as a theological statement, a view of God and God's relationship to human beings, it's quite steering, Voltaire's observation. The dervish says, when the king of Egypt sends a ship out onto the seas, do you think he worries about the rodents in the hold? Do you think he worries about the rodents drowning in the water in the hold? The ship of this universe had a shipbuilder. Voltaire is absolutely intellectually convinced of that. But the goodness, providence of that being in terms of the human experience of the world, uh, that is incomprehensible to Voltaire, and he's made his choice from abstract philosophy that cannot answer ultimate questions to a concern and focus on the human condition. We must cultivate our garden. He buys his estate, overlapping the boundaries of Savoy, French authority, and Geneva, Calvinist Geneva. He'll quip to a friend that when the Catholic clergy seeks to do him in, he'll just move to the Swiss parts of his estate. When the Calvinist clergy are furious against him, he just moves to the French side of his estate. He builds an estate, and unlike most now landowners with large numbers of farmer peasants working his land, um, he brings them into free trade in grains. He brings them into encouraging cottage industry at his estates at Ferney. You can visit it right near Geneva. You can take a bus from Geneva into French Ferney. And there's a statue of Voltaire in the center of the town, and the town is named Ferney, Voltaire Ferney. Huge statue in the center, the patriarch there. He encourages industry, innovations in agriculture. He cultivates his human garden, and he turns to the human condition, undertaking all of those campaigns and causes that we associate with the adjective Voltairean, campaigning against judicial murder in a system when it deals with religious or political crime, his constant attacks upon despotism in favor of freedom of commerce, his struggle against religious intolerance, against torture in the judicial system, against legal inequality, against serfdom, slavery, mercantile war, dynastic war, his campaigns for freedom of thought, and the cases that he takes to the conscience of Europe. When Jean Calas, a Protestant in fiercely, intensely Catholic Toulouse, is charged with the murder of his son, the rumor spreads that the depressive son who's committed suicide was killed by his father because he was going to convert to Catholicism. There is a farce of a trial, all evidence ignored. Jean Calas is broken on the wheel. Here's what that is: be broken on the wheel, the common act of torture for serious crimes involving crown or church. You are laid out on a large wheel, and with a precise science that keeps you from going into shock and experiencing the most intense pain, bones are broken one after the other. You are broken on the rack. Then, for such crimes, drawn and quartered, tied to 4 horses, they pull, trunk. That's being quartered, drawn, common 18th century punishment for the most serious crimes. An incision down there, you're still alive, you're a trunk, and your intestines are exposed. Voltaire paints these acts, bringing them to the conscience of Europe. Are you human beings who will accept this in the civilization you're a part of or not? And he changes European civilization. Before the French Revolution, the abolition of religious persecution in France, abolition of torture, abolition of serfdom. But above all, he changes the moral mentality of his readers. What is that tone like? You've read Voltaire, ironic, witty. This is Voltaire's treatise of toleration in the wake of the Jean Calas murders. And he will take many such cases to the conscience of Europe, and they will all be best sellers. This is the way the treatise of toleration begins. The murder of Calas, which was perpetrated with the sword of justice at Toulouse, March 9th, 1762, is one of the most singular events that deserve the attention of our own and of later ages. We quickly forget the long lists of the dead who have perished in our battles. It is the inevitable fate of war. Those who die by the sword might find themselves having inflicted death on their enemies and did not die without the means of defending themselves. When the risk and the advantage are equal, astonishment ceases and even pity is enfeebled. But when an innocent father is given into the hands of error, of passion, of fanaticism, when the accused has no defense but his virtue, when those who dispose of his life run no risk but that of making a mistake, when they can slay with impunity by a legal decree, then the voice of the general public is heard and each fears for himself. They can see that no man's life is safe before a court that has been set up in theory to guard the welfare of its citizens, and every voice is raised in a demand of vengeance. That's a different Voltaire from the Voltaire you encountered in Candide, as is this last short quote from perhaps one of the two or three most influential works written in the 18th century. Voltaire's treatise on toleration. This little globe, which is but a point, travels in space like many other globes. We are lost in the immensity. Man, about 5 feet high, average height, 18th century for a man, 5 feet. Man, about 5 feet high, is certainly a small thing in the universe, one of those imperceptible beings might say to some of his neighbors in Arabia or South Africa, listen to me, for the God of all these worlds has enlightened me. There are 900 million little ants like us on the earth, but my ant hole alone is dear to God. All the others are eternally reprobated by him. Mine alone will be happy. They would then interrupt me and ask, who was the fool that talked all this nonsense? I should be obliged to tell them it was themselves. I would then try to appease them, which would be difficult. Another very different Voltaire, and my laugh beginning here, and then we turn to you. In 1939, very dark moment of history, W.H. Auden, I think the great poet of the English-speaking world, mid-20th century, wrote a poem, Voltaire at Ferney, misses everything about Diderot, my favorite thinker of the 18th century, whom he's going to slight in this poem, but that's irrelevant. It's about Voltaire, and it'll give you a sense of what Voltaire came to represent for the intellectual world of the West, Voltaire's place in our civilization. Here's W.H. Auden, great poet of the 20th century, in his celebrated poem, Voltaire at Ferney. Almost happy now, he looked at his estate. An exile making watches glanced up as he passed, and he went on working where a hospital was rising fast. A joiner touched his cap. An agent came to tell him some of the trees he'd planted were progressing well. The white Alps glittered. It was summer. He was very great. Far off in Paris, where his enemies whispered that he was wicked, In an upright chair, a blind old woman, one of Voltaire's former lovers, a former mistress. They're both now in old age. A blind old woman longed for death and letters. He would write, "Nothing is better than life." But was it? Yes. The fight against the false and the unfair was always worth it. So was gardening, civilized, cajoling, scolding, screaming, cleverest of them all. He'd had the other children in a holy war against the infamous grown-ups, and like a child, been sly and humble. When there was occasion for the two-faced answer or the plain protective lie, but patient like a peasant, waited for their fall, and never doubted like D'Alembert he would win. Only Pascal was a great enemy. The rest were rats already poisoned. There was much, though, to be done, and only himself to count upon. Dear Diderot was dull, but did his best. Rousseau, he'd always known, would blubber and give in. So, like a sentinel, he could not sleep. The night was full of wrong, earthquake, and executions. Soon he would be dead, and still all over Europe stood the horrible nurses itching to boil their children. Only his verses, perhaps, could stop them. He must go on working. Overhead, the uncomplaining stars composed their lucid song. Voltaire at Ferney. It is Candide that freed him. An extraordinary work. Let me hear you talk about it. I'm interested in your questions. I'm interested in your thoughts. And I'm very grateful to you for the interest you've had in this text and for being here.
Well, if I could start with one quick question. I wonder if so it's a different Voltaire who's grappling with this question of the best of all possible worlds and the Voltaire that emerges from this self-searching process. But do you see the glimmers of the Voltaire he would become in Candide? I'm wondering,
So,
yeah. Well, I noticed that there are certain places within it as I was reading. It's so satirical and farcical throughout, but then there are certain places where it becomes sober. I'm thinking of the scene with the slave felt distinctly sober to me. There was still humor within it, but and then Martin the Manichean as a character, his voice always sounds earnest. So yeah, that's my question.
yeah, the book is filled with the same fury against abuses.
Mhm.
Um, and almost all of the elements of what Voltaire will be campaigning and crusading about. Um, they're in his prior work. They're certainly in Candide. If you look at crowns, religious persecution, torture, hanging, auto da fe, slavery, dynastic war, mercantile war, all of those dark themes are
Sure.
there. All of the social criticism is there, the social satire, the pretensions of aristocracy, the pretensions of despotism, the hypocrisy of clergy, the abuse of legal systems. All those themes, I think, are not
Yeah,
just
I
there, but part of the evil with which he's grappling.
right. And I understand that, but I guess often with satire comes a very strong sense of cynicism. And the Voltaire that you describe in later life does not sound cynical at all. So much of the book seems maybe has that tone of cynicism. I don't know. I guess that's what I'm trying to differentiate is this kind of satire and whether um, it's different from other satires in the sense of having still that core of Voltaire who wants to change the world and believes that it's possible, that that's still present in Candide.
In part, I think people thinking about your question uh, need to focus on what might or might not be a difference between cynicism and skepticism in Candide. The cynic doesn't care.
Mm-hmm.
Skeptics reach the same conclusion and care. Um, and I think Voltaire cares throughout. The darkness is just too dark. Um, Martin the Manichaean is, I think, a voice of cynicism. And
Mm-hmm.
Martin the Manichaean had the last word. I think it would have been a very, very different book if you think of them arguing about human beings and human nature on the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And Candide is saying, but human beings can change, will change. And Martin the Manichaean says, in effect, you know, does the hawk ever not prey, right, on the pigeon? Um, the human beings ever not prey on each other? And there could have been a cynical conclusion to Candide. There's a
Mm-hmm.
skeptical conclusion, but it seems to me it's not cynical. And the darkness of evil, the darkness of human injustice, um, darkness of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
These are very strong themes in Candide. Let's open this up.
Yes.
Um,
And
but
Nick,
I think on that issue of skepticism versus cynicism, one would need to think a good deal to sort through the issues you raised.
okay.
Because he's clearly tempted by both points of view throughout the book.
Mm-hmm.
But he ends with, well said, but we
Mm-hmm.
must cultivate our garden.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Nick.
There you go. Yeah, my question, I mean, I immediately have a thought just on what you said, but I'll hold that for myself later. My question is about, I think my favorite moment in the book was when Candide is going to go to Europe, I think, and he needs a traveler companion. And so, like, there's a bunch of people, and he says, well, whichever you can prove you're the most miserable or suffered the most, you're going to be the guy to come with me and you'll, be my companion. And, he ends up choosing Martin, partially because also he thinks he'll be a good conversationalist. But to me, like what stuck in my mind was, well, first, like, oh, there's like this really interesting setup. Maybe we'll hear like the actual conversations. But the philosophical point that came to my mind was the standard was suffering. The standard was who was the most miserable. And I wonder after everything you just said, going from like the everything's miserable and stagnant to let's be humanist and like change the world. I wonder what the standard would be when you're on the humanist um, worldview, the humanist philosophy, what the standard would be to choose someone worthy of traveling with you and spending time with.
And in terms of the major theme of the book, it's so reminiscent of the people telling their stories on the boat itself, right? When Candide meets the old woman who can tell the story of her life. And as Martin's predicted, everyone they meet on the ship has a dark story to tell. And there that is when he's interviewing who his traveling companion is going to be. It's a remarkable section, and it gives him Martin, um, a voice that threatens to overtake Candide's, but in the end doesn't. I want to hear your thought that you said you would save for later.
Um, my thought, I mean, Poco Corante to me sounded to be the cynical one who didn't care, and Martin didn't I guess Martin did seem skeptical, but like, yeah, definitely. But like he didn't seem, I don't know, he didn't, I don't know. I guess like they're both cynical, Pococurante and Martin, but like Pococurante really felt cynical to me. Martin just felt more defeated to me. He didn't come up that cynical to me, but I don't know. I read it twice, but you're the expert. I don't know, like I don't know what to take from it.
Be careful. No one's an expert on interpretation, right? You get 10 people, you'll get 10 different readings, and you can't go with the one who happened to be teaching you, right? But Senator Pococurante, I think you're absolutely right, is a perfect instance of cynicism. He doesn't care. And what's so striking about the point Voltaire can make with Pococurante is there are people who become cynical because they can't get from the world what they need from the world or what they think they need from the world. And they give up and become cynical, right? What does it say about our species if having everything you could dream of leaves you absolutely dissatisfied, right? You've got nothing to, of course, what we learn in the end is you've got nothing to work at. You've got nothing to cultivate. You've got to compare Pococurante to the family of Turks who have to labor to satisfy their real human needs. And then there's Pococurante, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I think he is the cynic. Um, and compared to Martin, his cynicism is on steroids. He does not care. He gets no satisfaction from anything he has or does. An ultimate. And so the answer to how do you end human misery is not just give people without their effort everything they would want. Um, that does not produce happiness at all. Pococurante is a bored, miserable, cynical human being. And there's that happy family of Turks. Voltaire always makes his happy people and his good people people who would be considered very marginal in Catholic France, right? The Islamic Turks, a Manichaean, an Anabaptist. Interesting. But Pococurante now becomes a type. People love to call each other Pococurantes after Candide.
I think I had the same reaction you did, Nick, at the idea that he doesn't care because he seems kind of despairing of the situation, and that seems like caring. But if you think of caring as actually taking action, having some element of action in your concern, he doesn't care. that seems true. Elizabeth.
Along that same line, I read somewhere that this section with Pococurante that these are Voltaire's ideas, and that Cicero was one of Voltaire's favorite authors. And but what I made a note of in this is that I think that one of the greatest retorts that Martin says to Voltaire to Candide when he's trying to justify this brilliant man, and Martin goes, which is to say, countered Martin, that there is pleasure to be had in not taking pleasure. That just was hilarious, laugh out loud, because so many people like that you just see it everywhere in human beings. That's all.
I think you also bring up a really valuable point about what makes Voltaire effective as a polemicist. People recognize things; they can't deny them. Right? You recognize elements of human life, human hypocrisy. A lot of the scenes in Candide are set real, and the readers know it. So, for example, the scene in the theater, what they're talking about, in fact, is Voltaire's play, L'Orphelin de Chine, and a performance of it. And the critics of it are the actual critics of Voltaire's play. And what happened in the theater is what actually happened in the theater when they come back off the coast from South America, off the coast of Europe, and they see the execution of Admiral Byng for not having risked the lives of yet more sailors in a hopeless naval encounter. That really happened. The English decided to execute Admiral Byng, and in Voltaire's phrase, which now becomes something said today, pour encourager les autres, to encourage the others. Let's shoot Admiral Byng on the deck of his ship. Voltaire met Admiral Byng when he was in England. He became a bit friendly with Admiral Byng. He admires military leaders who act to minimize the loss of these poor troops who they command. That's fierce for Voltaire, but he just puts it in, and everyone recognizes this is not a fictional creation. I said earlier, the Jesuits in Paraguay, absolutely real. Their enslaving of people, absolutely real, and the readers know this. So they're immersed in their world, looking at it somewhat differently. And if everyone has a confessor, if every woman reading this in 18th century France has a confessor, when Voltaire talks about seduction by confessors, which happens several times throughout this book, everyone in the 18th century understands that and suddenly has to confront it as a fact of life. You have a very worldly church. Is the home of second and third sons, the church. And it gives very worldly clerics an extraordinary circumstance, at least weekly confession of the wives, single women, anyone you think of as attractive, and you question that person on her intimate fantasies, on her life, on her sexuality, on her encounters. And now you're in the seductive position. It's just a known part of 18th century life that people don't talk about, don't think about too much. An anomalous event that shouldn't be happening, but there it is. And the ability to put people in a life they recognize in his text is a very important polemical technique.
So follow up on Poco Carante, because I read too in the footnotes of this copy that a lot of his views on art were Voltaire's views. So was he was this just an opportunity to have the fun of sharing his views on all these authors? Or why is he making Poco Carante his voice on art?
There's no singular answer to that question. Like almost all Enlightenment philosophers, he obsesses on the Stoics. They read the Stoics. Cicero, Marcus Aurelius are beloved authors for the French Enlightenment. But I think the real import of Poco Carante, anything that he's putting in, you can take back to his life, his thought. But I think the real point of Senator Poco Carante is this astonishing fact of human life, that you look at the people you envy. You look at people who without effort seem to have everything. That without effort looms large. And the boredom of the European elites is something that's part of the human comedy and the human tragedy.
Well, I guess I just was so delighted by that whole section because of the boldness of attacking, criticizing Homer and Milton. So it seemed like he did kind of, in the creation of that character, relish the opportunity to say some, express some unpopular views on art.
Yep.
Um,
But
and
if you really want to see that also in Voltaire, in his philosophical letters, when he turns to literature, and skewers Shakespeare, he's a classicist, Voltaire. Uh, interesting.
yeah.
Incidentally, I see hands up, but anyone interested in talking more about Martin? I'd love to get a couple of his observations out and see what people make of them. But let's take questions first or comments first.
Okay. Nick, you had your hand up.
Oh yeah, just on that, like, so you just said that maybe, tell me if I got this right, but maybe Pococurante envies these great men, Homer, Milton, etc. And that's kind of like what's going on there. But as Lisa just said, which I saw myself, that these are Voltaire's views almost verbatim. And so my question now is just going off of what you just said, is, but does Voltaire envy these great men? But that doesn't sound possible or correct, because the view of him that you just gave in your opening notes was that he's this awesome humanist who cares about changing the world. He's such a positive guy, it sounds like. He doesn't seem like the type to like be envious of great achievement. But what's your thought on that? Do you think he was envious of them or not?
I think he envied Newton. I think he envied Locke, Bacon. But what one's really talking about there is an extraordinary admiration. And he is jealous of his reputation always, and especially when he gets into theater. If you had asked Voltaire at any point in the 18th century what he was going to be remembered most for, he would have said his theater, which is the least read part of Voltaire these days. Give you a wonderful piece of irony. They were going to stage Voltaire's play in Geneva, Mohammed or Fanaticism, which in one of those delicious moments of Voltairean irony, he got the Pope to endorse. And it was published with a statement of praise by the Pope. Voltaire wrote Muhammad or Fanaticism, play about how Muhammad began to lay the foundations of his conquests. And maybe 20 years ago, the city of Geneva banned it because of the offense it would give to the Muslim population of Geneva. And Tariq Ramadan is the person who is most behind getting it banned, someone quite beloved by a large number of Western intellectuals, Tariq Ramadan. So there we have 10 miles from Ferney, Voltaire's play on Muhammad being banned in the 21st century in Geneva. Not uninteresting. Martin the Manichaean. Let me lay out the passages where he expresses himself and see what you think Voltaire does give to that voice that tempted him for a while. And yet there is some on page 56. And yet there is some good in the world, Candide would reply. That may be so, Martin would say, but I have not experienced it. And on page 59, do you think, said Candide, that men have always massacred one another as they do today? That they have always been liars, cheats, traitors, ingrates, and brigands, as well as weaklings, shirklings, shirkers, cowards, backbiters, gluttons, drunkards, misers, and social climbers, in addition to being bloodthirsty, slanderous, fanatical, debauched, hypocritical, and downright stupid. Well, there's Voltaire and Candide's assessment. Well then, said Martin, if hawks have always had the same nature, why do you expect men to change theirs? Oh, said Candide, but there is a crucial difference, because free will, ... and philosophizing, thus they arrived in Bordeaux. On page 61, third of four. Monsieur, said Candide to the Abbe, how many plays have been written in French? 5 or 6,000, came the reply. That's a lot, said Candide. And how many of them are any good? 15 or 16, replied the other. That's a lot, said Martin. And finally, on page 65, I have seen worse, Candide replied, but a wise man, who has since had the misfortune to be hanged, taught me that there is in these things a perfect propriety, like the shadows in a beautiful painting. Your hanged man was making a mockery of us, interjected Martin, and your shadows are in truth dreadful stains. It is men who make these stains, said Candide, and they cannot do otherwise. So it is not their fault, then, said Martin. Most of the card players who did not understand a word of this were busy drinking while Martin disputed with the man of learning, and Candide recounted some of his adventures to the lady of the house. So there's Martin's role in these moments of discussion. What do you make of these characters who get to make their arguments, and of the narrator's relationship to them? And what still remains for you, sides of Voltaire and Candide, that you'd like to hear what other people think about?
One thing I notice is that there's a lot of philosophizing, the ... They just go on talking about things, but he's very passive in action. But then I just noticed on page 93, there's a quote from him that seemed so significant that it's odd to me that it's in the voice of Martin. Let us set to work and stop proving things, said Martin, for that is the only way to make life bearable.
Yeah, and that follows a kind of typical citation of Bible and authority leading to one inescapable conclusion. And it's a kind of madcap paragraph. You laugh at anyone arguing that way. And that's Martin's model. Human beings attempting to answer their doubts and grief in life. And you will not prove that you are not miserable, appears to be you cannot prove that you are living in a good world. So work for it. Work for the things you need. But that, of course, is Voltaire's conclusion, work for the things you need. And it's good that you show Martin raising that same conclusion right by the conclusion of this work, right before, in effect, Candide says the same thing to Pangloss. That is well said, but we must cultivate our garden. Even Martin appears to be coming around to the work is the one answer. They've met the Turks.
Mhm.
Striking.
Elizabeth?
Okay, well, just now I thought that it seems to me that Martin seems like, if you wanted to call him philosophically a realist, you know, um, I mean, just bold, and there is no other way for him but realism. He only is a realist. Whereas Candide seems like a romantic character, and someone who, wants to believe the best, and is always seeking the best and expecting the best. And I just wondered uh, um, what you think of that, or how that sits with the philosophy that they're describing in this book.
Tell me what conclusion you reached on that.
I think, well, it seems to me that what's happening in the book, if I once wrote a play about Voltaire, so I have a kind of, I'm learning more and more, and I have a sense of what he must have been struggling with, writing this book. So it seems to me that if I look at it as this is Voltaire writing these characters, that it's Voltaire struggling with the two sides of himself. He's that he has this realistic side. He can't deny this, but he also can't quite let go of being an optimistic human.
Yeah, I think that that's a very deep observation about what's happening in this. That it reads, I think, much more openly if one adopts that sense that these characters who philosophize are a part of Voltaire. That he's had those voices in his mind. And he knows what those voices feel like. He even knows what Pangloss's voice feels like, since he's been there and he's been Leibnizian. And he certainly knows what Martin's voice sounds like. And I'd relate this also to Lisa's point, which seems to be really important. When they philosophize, it concludes again and again with a dot, 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 dot. These are not, well, you can't close these ultimate philosophical arguments, right? You just can't close them. And even when he's letting Martin make his points dramatically, right, it's still, after a philosophical argument, dot, 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 dot. That's open. There's no period at the end of those. And I think Voltaire both knows all of those different voices, but is tempted by them. And maybe one of the ways to think about the conclusion and Ira Wade's realization from the manuscript, oh my God, he was planning to let Martin carry the narrative. And that wasn't it then for him. Is Martin seems, and Voltaire lets him be the realist. I think that's the right term. But Martin's realism ends up not being ultimately realistic if it doesn't issue in something humanly useful, if it doesn't issue in some way for human beings to deal with the human condition. And in the end, then, Martin's Manichaeanism, if we use your categories, perhaps is as romantic as Candide's initial naivete, and the realism at the end is given to Candide. That's well said, but we must cultivate our garden. And that's why I needed to talk about Ferney at the beginning, and Voltaire at Ferney, and what that means in the history of civilization. It frees him up, this book. It is cathartic. And he's not Martin the Manichean. And the point isn't simply to make a counter argument to optimism philosophically. It's somehow to show you the human condition in a way that you conclude. What does it mean to talk about whatever is right under the perfection of God's creation when you look at the human condition. This is what you see. Well said, but let's cultivate our garden. Heather, you have a hand up.
Yeah, I have sort of two questions that are related. One has to do with this idea of skepticism versus cynicism. And it seems like what Voltaire reaches is a sort of optimistic skepticism. He doesn't think that,
Oh, that's a lovely phrase.
well, he doesn't think that you can get to an answer, but he's optimistic. He thinks that you can make things better through effort. And so it's sort of a skepticism in the intellectual sense, but an optimism in the realist sense, I guess. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think that's very good. It jars when you think of the title of the book, right? Candide or optimism. But I think you're right that ultimately, the sense we must cultivate our garden and the meaning that he's going to give with the rest of his life to that phrase. And it is remarkable that someone should be at his most dynamic, intellectually, morally, and civically effective in his old age. It's I couldn't do it. It's quite remarkable, this man's life. But what you're saying is, by the ordinary language meaning of optimism, right? He's rejected philosophical optimism. He's rejected theological optimism. And the alternative ultimately gives us certain human optimism. And it may not be an overflowing optimism in Candide, which paints the human condition so darkly, but after all that experience, for Candide to end that book with, but we must cultivate our garden, right? Il faut cultiver notre jardin. How does one not see that as ordinary language optimism?
Mhm. Well, that's the interesting thing, is that in a sense, Martin is starting to come around to the same conclusion in what he said, but there's a big difference in tone. I think, Elizabeth, your comment helped me to see that. Let us set to work and stop proving things, for that's the only way to make life bearable. So that's a different tone from
Yes. No, that's important. That Martin's, that's right. Martin's coming to peace with the world is we can make life bearable. And Voltaire's going to envisage something beyond that. But you can't get to the human condition for Voltaire if people look at this world and deny the reality of evil, deny the reality of a flawed creation. I mean, it's for Voltaire, if you think back to that line I cited from the poem on the Lisbon earthquake, when he says, God, my respect, creating a universe is no small thing, right? God, my respect, but my love, weak humans claim. Now, that's the poem on the Lisbon earthquake, written a few years before Candide. My love, weak humans claim. And Candide, in some sense, is an ongoing illustration of that. The other thing I think that you always want to, here's a dramatic statement, that you always want to keep in mind with every author you read, and above all, every philosopher you read, but most human beings you encounter, is you must know who the interlocutor is. With whom is someone discussing? If you just think of your own life, someone saw you arguing with someone, let's just for the sake of argument, put you on the left. Okay. If someone saw you arguing with someone yet further to your left, they'd hear one kind of voice. If they heard you arguing with someone whose mind you're really interested in changing and who's open-minded, they'd hear another voice. If they heard you arguing or responding to someone on the moderate right or far, they would hear a completely different voice. And I used to point this out to my students and say, well, when you argue with someone who thinks America is the most magnificent country in the world, and you've got this optimistic classmate, you sound this way, right? But when you're in Europe and meet some snooty French kid who thinks America is all materialistic, money grubbing, and has no sense of, then you sound completely different. Well, philosophers are the same way, writers are the same way. It depends on the interlocutor. Whose arguments are you addressing? And depending on that, you can sound very, very different. And Voltaire, above all else in this text, is responding to Rousseau's letter on providence, that it is anti-human and it is blasphemous, and it is writing against God, to decry the condition of the physical and moral world. That's his interlocutor. And it's important to know that.
John?
Dr. Kors, at any point in Voltaire's life, did he question his belief in a creator?
That is such an interesting question. And in terms of, can the adaptation of species to their environmental niche? Desert animals have desert camouflage. Arctic animals have Arctic camouflage. Every species has a system of ingestion, excretion, reproduction. Can that be explained by natural phenomena? And Voltaire's intellectual answer is no. It is beyond chance that every animal is adapted to its ecological niche, that bodies are designed to survive and procreate. Voltaire argues with the atheist all of his intellectual life. But to have a God whose goodness cannot be proved, whose perfection cannot be proved, to have a God that does not command, think when he's focused on the Lisbon earthquake, a God that cannot demand love from us, because God could have created a world in which people don't die in pain, people don't slaughter each other, earthquakes, famines, plagues don't occur. What is it to believe in God, a creator, architect of the world, but not believe in a God whose goodness is manifest to us in ways that reconcile us to the world he created? Right? There's no story of the fall in Voltaire. He's not a Christian. Human beings are dealing with the faculties God gave them. And here we are. Doesn't look to me for Voltaire as if it's created by a perfect being. But desert animals, each adapted to desert environments, Arctic to Arctic environments. Study an insect's eye and all the things that have to coordinate for an insect to see. How isn't that designed? Voltaire's argument is, you walk into the middle of a forest and there you see a clock that's telling time in different places in the world. And it's built in such a way that when the hands strike the hour, right? St. George comes out and strikes a dragon, and you say, oh, it's just like the trees, it's here by chance. For Voltaire, it cannot be by chance that the world is ordered, adapted, designed. It's got to be by intelligent design, but it doesn't make moral sense. And we appear to be on our own, and a Manichaean who believes that the world makes sense if you give us two co-equal forces of good and evil has better philosophical arguments than a deist or a Christian. So there's Voltaire reaching conclusions that are difficult to reconcile internally. So you stop thinking about theology as your primary focus and you turn to the human condition. His other concern with atheism is he worries that some people need to believe in a judge watching all of their actions to restrain themselves from wicked behavior. And he is the author also of a quite famous quip on the role of God in helping human beings keep themselves moral. He wrote, if God did not exist, we would have had to invent him. A somewhat skeptical, somewhat cynical, somewhat optimistic line from Voltaire. He's accused of having said, but when you discuss God, don't do it in front of the servants. So you can discuss atheism, but not in front of the servants, but he never said that. But he implies at various times that absent the belief in God, human beings might not be restrained. He dislikes the atheists. He thinks they're dogmatic. He can't believe they think they know what occurred in the creation, right, or non-creation of a world. And some of them dislike Voltaire. Diderot writes a magnificent piece about Voltaire when Voltaire writes a poem going after the atheists in Paris. One of them writes a screed against Voltaire, and Diderot takes that person to task publicly, saying, you can write what you write because of Voltaire and the risks he took. You're his child. How dare you talk about it that way? And then you've got poor Auden minimizing my beloved Diderot. That's another story.
Nick?
Well, yeah, just going back to like the conclusion of the story and how we read it, whether we're coming to skepticism or optimistic skepticism, I actually had a different interpretation, which is funny because you said you can get 10 different interpretations. I had a totally different one. In the conclusion, chapter 30, I don't have page numbers, so I can't tell you exactly what this is, but it's the stanza that begins with, this speech gave rise to new speculations, which is the third stanza of the chapter. So the speech it's referring to is the old woman saying all of the bad, miserable stuff that happened to her, saying, what would be better for this, and this to happen, or to be bored and sit here and do nothing? And then Candide said, that is a hard question. So the stanza I'm referring to is the thing that comes right after that, and it's this. So this speech gave rise to new speculations, and Martin in particular came to the conclusion that man was born to endure either the convulsions of anxiety or the lethargy of boredom. Candide did not agree with this, but he did not press the point. Pangloss conceded that he had suffered horribly all his life, but having once maintained that everything was going splendidly, he would continue to do so, while believing nothing of the kind. So the way I read that was him turning to pragmatism, actually, that believing, kind of like you just said, well, if there wasn't a God, you had to invent one. He's kind of like believing in the optimism, but inventing it for himself, but not actually believing, like, yeah, it's not actually true. And so I view like the end of the story of turning to that humanism as, well, I can't, we can't really like genuinely believe in like the optimism in people or the goodness of people, or that they can't really change. But pragmatically, we are going to operate as if, all of that was true. That's kind of how I saw it, but different interpretation.
Can I ask a quick clarification? Are you seeing Pangloss as Voltaire's voice in that paragraph? Is that why?
No, I see it. Well, I don't know what Voltaire's. I mean, like Voltaire would definitely be like the humanist positive person, but I think that would be more like maybe Voltaire's formal philosophy. Like he can't answer the formal philosophy of Leibniz, but like he's still a pragmatist humanist. I also don't think I have a full conclusion as to what my thought is, but this is what I'm thinking right now.
I think Lisa's response would certainly be mine in large part. I think it's hard to give Pangloss too much of a positive role in terms of Voltaire's conclusions. My sense is that where you're right is that for Voltaire, there are questions that simply can't and won't be answered. And you live life without the ability to answer them. You live life with unanswered mega questions about the ultimate nature of things. But the humanism in Voltaire is tied directly to accepting the reality of human suffering, of irredeemable injustice, of irredeemable cruelty in the world. And Pangloss's refusal to give up his philosophy. I mean, it's this also wonderful riff on philosophers by Voltaire that of course they no longer believe this, but it having been their position, they'll stay with it without really believing it. And that's an interesting observation about the world, that there are people who hold fast to views that in fact they do not believe in, which is striking. So Pangloss's voice is in there. It really is in there. And Voltaire has had it in his own soul in earlier times. But I think Lisa's right that the one thing that would be hardest to do, but would be interesting to do, stay with it, would be the positive role of Pangloss articulating views that Voltaire wants the reader to take away. But this issue of what exactly is Voltaire's humanism, I mean, it's very dramatic if you put it in 18th century terms, that the human condition and human suffering is more important than God. That's, you say it that way, it's quite dramatic, isn't it? As a theological, philosophical, or humanistic physician. And he's saying nothing less than that.
Could we say that he's skeptical? He has a skepticism about what to say about the problem of evil, but no skepticism about the fact that it is a problem, whereas Pangloss is denying that it's a problem.
And that a problem because evil is real.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Physical and moral evil is real. And the reason in Candide, they always stated physical and moral evil is if you're approaching why suffering, why evil in the world from the position of we were in Eden and then there was the fall and human beings are the authors of this. So there are theological debates from the beginning of Christianity on as to whether or not before the fall there were such things as earthquakes. If physical evil only comes into the world with the fall, but from Voltaire's non-Christian perspectives and from the Enlightenment's generally non-Christian perspectives, there is no fall. Physical evil is part of the creation. It's built into the creation. And moral evil, since there was no fall, is there from the start. Murder. Will human beings ever stop massacring each other? The question that Candide and Martin debate, that's there from the start. So the issue of physical evil lands back in the docket against God. Earthquakes, cancer, plague. Voltaire is joining the issue on, can you look at this world and think that theology, rather than the human condition, ought to be your focus? And that is a moment of dramatic change in our civilization.
Nick, I just want to point out one line prior to this paragraph you mentioned, which I think there's a lot that conditions you to dismiss anything that Pangloss says as being mocked by Voltaire. And on page 90, it says Pangloss, well, let's see, it's a paragraph about he'd been swindled so many times by Jews that all he had left in the end was his little farm, his wife, and so on. And then it describes Cacambo, what Cacambo did, and then it says Pangloss was in despair at not being able to shine at some German university. So that's the thing that Pangloss despairs over. It takes every bit of earnestness out of any of his philosophical conclusions. It's just about shining in a university.
And again, since we're on chapter 30, note again the role of work, of labor that you can trade, of labor that makes you part of a productive community. The society of this little band of survivors, right? Bottom of 93, the little society all entered into this laudable plan. Let's work and not do philosophy. Each began to exercise his talents. The small farm yielded a great deal. True, Cunegonde was still very ugly, but she became an excellent pastry chef. Paquette embroidered. The old woman took care of the laundry. Everyone made himself useful, including Brother Giuffolo, who was a first-rate carpenter and even became some quite good company. So the ending, playing off human effort, human work toward the satisfaction of basic human needs, human effort on the one side, and a quest to understand why do we suffer in a world created by a good God. That's a ... The human condition, as Candide indicates on every page, is real and so often painful. Heather, and then I probably should wrap things up.
I have to get in one question from Joseph after Heather, or he will never forgive me. But okay, Heather.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. Well, so my question is to do with what is a good world in their view before Voltaire, and also was he part of a transition to another idea of what a good world is? Because it seems like the idea of what goodness is, or a good world, is very theological in terms of goodness is what a good God makes. And so on the one hand, you've got the Leibnizians saying, well, if God made it, then it must be good. And then you've got Voltaire saying, well, no, there's this new idea of like human suffering. If humans are suffering, then that's evil. So a good God couldn't have made this. And so then is there like a transition to an idea of goodness being a world where there can be good in it, as opposed to a world where there is no evil in it?
Your question is so deep because it really is about the whole 18th century shift in mentality and moral thinking and political thinking. I mean, the first thing that would come to mind from reading Voltaire up through this point is what you have to change, and the remediable before you get to what is the ultimate good life is a question, and good society is a question. Voltaire, there are all of these remediable causes of human suffering. So if you take an earlier campaign that's ongoing, it's still going on now and lasts throughout his whole life, Voltaire in the 1730s opens up a campaign for the introduction of inoculation against smallpox in France. It's been practiced in England, and he's looked at the demography, at the mortality table, the English mortality table, death and suffering by smallpox rapidly declining. And Voltaire wants smallpox introduced in France and writes a magnificent argument on behalf of the introduction of smallpox in France. The Crown refers it to its two intellectual authorities, Faculty of Medicine, Faculty of Theology. Faculty of Medicine says medicine has traditions. And the first rule of medicine is first, do no harm. The Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. You may not give someone a case of smallpox. Right? Inoculation in the 18th century is you take a mild smallpox, not cowpox, mild smallpox, give someone a mild case of smallpox, lifetime immunity against serious fatal cases or disfiguring cases of smallpox. Well, it's referred to the two faculties, right? Faculty of Medicine says we have traditions in medicine, do no harm. Faculty of Theology says no to inoculation, that's mankind playing God. Only God gives diseases. Getting a disease is an act of providence, right? So there is Voltaire crusading to something that he says this can save hundreds of thousands of lives, save hundreds of thousands of people from disfigurement and death. And what's preventing it? The medical belief that you can't innovate given the medical traditions, and two, that human beings can't play God by preventing, right, by giving someone a mild case of a disease to prevent serious cases. So it's all the remediable causes. You don't need a disquisition on the good life for Voltaire to argue against go through the list, judicial murder, freedom of commerce, religious intolerance, legal inequality, serfdom, slavery, mercantile war, dynastic war. You attack all of those things, and in some sense, a vision of a better world comes from attacking the remediable causes of human suffering. So ultimately, he believes in certain rights, right? And human beings are all equal. He believes in a utilitarian criterion that if people have power, if people have authority, their goal should be to reduce human suffering and enhance the means by which human beings can achieve well-being. And he will certainly write on morality. He will write on. Let me recommend some reading for people interested in Voltaire's view of the good life. Voltaire's Philosophical Letter, 1730s, at his most optimistic, talking about what England, as opposed to France, has achieved, And then I would read his treatise on toleration. And then a wonderful alphabetical set of articles and reflections that he modifies over time, his philosophical dictionary. And you can look up any topic alphabetically and see what he's saying about it. And I'll just remind you that he is a protean figure. He spills out of any category if you're going to put him in. The man I knew who studied him the most, who lived with him forever, Ira Wade, who replicated his life, read every letter the man ever wrote. When I asked Ira Wade, well, look at the seeming contradictions here. He says this here, he says that there, and he's writing to people he usually speaks his mind to. And Ira Wade said to me, Alan, every morning Voltaire woke up, sat on the edge of his bed, scratched his head, and said, well, what can I do to confuse Ira Wade today? Voltaire will confuse you every morning, but he's worth staying with, and a remarkable figure, and a profoundly influential figure. And what a joy to have met you all and know that this interest in Voltaire and in Candide is still out there.
May I ask you Joseph's question, which is your
Oh,
last
absolutely.
was a
Sorry.
perfect segue to it. So first, when we were chatting earlier, he commented that it could be argued that today we're in a culture of intellectuals who would say we're in the worst of all possible worlds. But the question was, I'm just going to read it as he wrote it to me. Did the cultural context of the time make it ripe for Candide? Or could that kind of impact happen in a context where you wouldn't say that of the culture? And
Again,
yeah. Well, the follow-up is, of course, is there anything about today's culture that makes you optimistic a new Voltaire could have an impact like that?
I'm waiting. I think we desperately need a satirist, and we definitely need a social critic who engages in that kind of satire. I fear Voltaire would get canceled by all sides were he to start writing now. But let's go to Joseph's question. One of the pressures that I think you see in Voltaire is it's an intellectual century that has discovered it can understand so much about the universe. It is so intellectually optimistic. In the 17th century, when Johannes Kepler articulated his discovery of the laws of planetary motion, as he's announcing the third law, in which he's worked decades, Kepler writes this. He says, it may be that my reader will not appear for 50, 100, 1,000 years. This doesn't concern me. Hasn't God himself waited 6,000 years for a human mind to contemplate his work with understanding? The 17th and 18th century did not believe that it was framing laws of nature. It was discovering laws of nature. It was not arranging things in its mind. It was discovering the laws of motion, the laws of planetary motion, the circulation of the blood, Gilbert and magnetism. It was discovering how the world worked. It had new means to do this. It had microscopes. It discovered universes it didn't know existed. It had telescopes. And it was discovering the mechanisms, the laws of nature. It made the 17th and 18th century mind that's part of this new philosophical movement feel somehow closer to, connected to God, touching his designs, his plans, his purposes, his laws. But the more that that theological optimism builds, it's also encountering the other side of 18th century thought, which is the world can be improved. The world has serious, serious flaws. We can improve agriculture. We can reduce the effects of flood. In short, we can intervene in God's nature with an understanding of the laws of nature and use that knowledge to improve the human condition. But the more that thought is directed toward the improvement of the human condition, the more it has to encounter all the sources of human suffering and deal with intellectually the sources of human suffering and the reasons for human suffering and the reality of human injustice. And indeed, if you look who gets struck down by disease, who dies old, who dies young, the injustice of the world, the injustice of the cosmos. Well, hyper-optimistic natural theology meets hypercritical discussion of human suffering, pain and its remediable causes. That's a culture that's ready for some dramatic, indeed, as you see at the end of the 18th century and revolutions everywhere, explosive encounters with the human reality and efforts to change it. So a very dramatic moment of civilizational history. Joseph's question goes deep. Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much for giving us this time. I'm so grateful.
Well, the first class I ever taught on Voltaire, 1968, September, University of Pennsylvania. I had just turned 25. My students were maybe 2 or 3 years younger than I was. And dressed to the hilt, trying to act what I am now, 80 years old when I'm 25, so I get the respect of my students. And I go, and a hippie commune had all signed up together for my seminar. My first moment of college teaching. I walk into a seminar room. The smoke of pot is so heavy that I involuntarily find myself having a contact fight walking in to teach my first course. They had an assignment. They had read Voltaire's philosophical letters. And I now asked my first question as a college teacher. I asked, what do you think Voltaire most wanted to change his readers' minds? What's this polemic aiming at? And now my first experience with a student, he looked up high as a kite and said to me, well, last night I was reading Voltaire. I got really stoned and I saw it. Voltaire and Norman Mailer are the same people. You know what I mean? And I, desperate, terrified, and feeling now is about 180, said, do you mean they're both social satirists? They're both social critics? And he looked at me with what can only be described as infinite pity. And he said to me, okay, I can live with that. You have one of those minds that likes to take things apart. That's cool. Me, I have one of those minds that like to put things together. You know what I mean? And that was my first moment of college teaching, my first moment of teaching Voltaire. It's been an adventure ever since. And this was just wonderful. Reading, stay with Voltaire. He is endlessly of interest. Philosophical letters, treatise on toleration. Thank you.
Thank you so much.